Welcome, everyone. I'm glad to see you all here for the discussion and reflection sessions of the 2020 International Roundtable, Facing Pandemics of Disease and Race, Radically Rethinking for Liberatory Futures. Before we start the program, I'm going to give you just a few tech tips. We welcome and thank today's closed captioner, Carissa. To access the closed captioning, you can click on the CC button at the bottom of your screen and then click Show Subtitle. Instructions are also in the chat. And so you can click on the chat and find the instructions there. If you have technical questions, please drop a note to the tech in the chat. If you clicked on the drop-down list in the chat, you'll find tech support there, and you can ask those kinds of questions there. Our intent is to be inclusive and welcoming of all attendees, and we ask you to approach this critical conversation with openness and respect for the speakers and other participants. We reserve the right to remove participants whose actions are not consistent with Macalester's community standards, which state in part, we do not tolerate anything defamatory or containing personal attacks or any form of harassment. And that's the end of the tech tips. Although we're zooming in from many places, this is an event of an educational institution on the land of the Sisseton and Wahpeton bands of the Dakota people. Although the college occupies the lands because of histories of forced removals and persistent settler colonialism, this is still Dakota land. The legal concept of property is built on the violation of Indigenous sovereignty. As we celebrate the removal of statues and the renaming of buildings, we also acknowledge how much of our existence is built on the continued violence and erasures of Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples. As we honor the strength and survival of Dakota ancestors, we're called on to move beyond the symbolic and to make accountability real by centering and building with descendants of those whose lands and labor provide the foundations of our work in education. We also honor the lives and memories of those whose murders by agents of the state inspire the current movement for justice. Travis Jordan, Vernon May, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Philando Castile, Jamar Clark, Brian Quinones, Fong Lee, and many others. I invite you to take a moment to breathe and to reflect on those acknowledgements. Thank you. And now a quick reminder, something that I was supposed to do in the tech check. If you're not muted, could you please mute yourself, and that will help to remove distractions from the conversations. So the format for today's session is this. We'll do some brief introductions, and then we'll move into breakout rooms by topic that you've signed up for. Unfortunately, to keep numbers manageable, we weren't able to give everybody their first choice, but everyone, I think, is in a discussion in their first or second choice. After a 40-minute discussion, we'll reconvene back in the main room. And at that point, rather than have the sort of typical report back from the groups, the discussion leaders are going to have a roundtable discussion to bring in what they heard in the discussions and their thoughts on the topics. And then after that roundtable, we'll open it up for general conversation and question and answers from everybody. But before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the IRT Planning Committee. Professor Catherine Chang in Geography, Professor Ruth Ann Godelli, Art and Art History, Professor Olga Gonzalez, Anthropology, and the Annan Institute for Global Citizenship, Ellen Holt-Worley, Archives and Special Collections in the Library, Ruth Yanish, Assistant Dean for Educational Partnerships in the IGC, Sedric McClure, Assistant Dean, Department of Multicultural Life, Professor Khaldoun Saman, Sociology, and Marjorie Trueblood, Dean of Multicultural Life. This group has worked for about a year. We started at this time last year and made all the pivots that we've all gone through to make the IRT interesting, relevant, and doable. And so we're glad that you're here for this conversation. And I know that some of you have been in groups to discuss Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower. For any of you who have not read the book, it reads like a history of the 2020s, even though it was written in 1993. And so that provides another backdrop for some of the conversation here. And some of you listened to the plenary session earlier today, State of Emergency or State of Opportunity, Tools and Practices for Self-Determination. And in that conversation about care and mutual aid, speakers brought forward histories and inspiration by people who've always had to do community care, peoples who have not been served by democratic governance, but those who live out the continual active harm that's rooted in structures, practices, and cultures built from enslavement, colonialism, and the taking of indigenous lands and resources. So some of you have been engaged in these earlier conversations, but this discussion and reflection session does not require that. That was part of why you're here. And so as you move into your groups, please keep in mind that if you did go to those sessions, that not everybody will know what you might not know what you're talking about. And so keep that in mind as you make comments and participate in the conversation. So this session in particular is designed to provide the opportunity for discussion and reflection on the themes from this year's IRT. What we're learning about the quote unquote normal worlds, that the COVID pandemic and the cycles of police murders, protests, and repression, as well as a national leader who leads with hate, what that all opens up for us, both in terms of seeing things with new eyes and also opportunities to do things in different kinds of ways. So we're learning a lot from also about how we all interpret and experience the normal differently, depending on how we're positioned in society based on our different identities and other kinds of social factors. So the discussion session won't be focused so much on what we're seeing in terms of that analysis, but much of the conversation is going to be focused more on what might we do differently as we see what hasn't been working and what might be some of the founding values and ways of approaching the building of new worlds. So now I would like to turn over to the discussion leaders and have them introduce themselves and just say a little bit about the topics that they will be leading. Let's start with Sedric.
Can everyone hear me? All right, so I want to be sure my mute was off. Good afternoon to everyone. My name is Sedric McClure. I use he, him pronouns. I work in the Department of Multicultural Life, and the discussion we'll be talking about in my group is creating space for radical belonging. I didn't want to get too heady and talked about radical belonging because I think as human beings, we kind of belong to each other by affinity or association. And so I think that we take some time to gather and to see what we share in common and the differences that we have, and to begin to think about the ways in which we belong with each other. It's going to be a struggle in terms of identifying those things, perhaps, but to find those connecting points in a radical way so we can begin to explore what that means in that circle and find ways to create pathways to invite others in that circle and free from, hierarchy, oppression, and other forms of exclusion. So thank you.
Thank you, Sedric. And next, Jennings.
My name is Jennings Mergenthal. I use they, them pronouns. I am class of 2021. I'm a history and biology major. I do not have a spiel nearly as prepared as Sedric's, but in my group, we are going to talk about the apocalypse.
And that intrigues everybody. Next, we'll have Olga.
Okay, sorry about that. So my name is Olga Gonzalez. Thank you to everybody for being here. I use she, her, ella as pronouns, and the title of the discussion group I'm going to be leading is Mutual Aid and Social Transformation. And I gave it that title, not so much because I was familiar with the concept of mutual aid, but because in the process of learning about it, I was surprised that we were coming up with this concept of mutual aid, which seems to me more Western oriented. And in comparison to my experience as a Peruvian growing up and being raised and working in the context of Latin America, more specifically Peru, these are practices that go way back, and some of them are indigenous. So, but I was interested in how we were applying and using these in conversation with different notions also of democracy, as if we all understood democracy in the same way. So, I would like us to have a conversation around these concepts, their utility and how sustainable they are, and looking even into other experiences. What can we learn of what failed in earlier experiences and how to face those challenges? Mhm.
Great, thank you. And Fatiya.
Hi everyone, my name is Fatiya Kedir. I use she, her, hers. I'm from Minneapolis, Minnesota by way of Nairobi, Kenya, and current senior at Macalester. So my topic is focused on radical love and care with a focus on women of color. I found that through my readings, academic and personal readings, as well as my conversations with a range of people, primarily Black women, that many current ideas of activism and progress that we have seem to kind of copy and paste the thoughts and structures, environments that we seemingly are trying to progress from or move away from. So I'm excited to kind of have a dialogue on what we can learn from women of color in that route.
Great, thank you so much to all of you. And I'll just say, I'm going to lead a fifth unadvertised group, and this is for people who are not able to sign up for one of the 4 other groups. So we'll have a conversation on care, mutual aid, and self-determination, what this means for academia. Welcome back. So we're going to start off with having the discussion leaders say a few words about their conversation. Sedric, could we start with you?
Yes, I'm just gonna, something's popped up on my screen. I want to just say, not now. Okay, so yeah, we were talking about this whole notion of radical belonging, and we started off by just saying, when you hear the word belonging, what comes to mind? We were not oblivious to the challenges and structures around us, limitations of race, class, gender, and so forth. But what I wanted to, what we're getting at is that this whole idea is that when you walk into a space that somebody has thought enough about you, and even if they don't know the details, they make you feel safe, they make you feel welcome, they make you feel cherished, and they make you feel valued. So these are all positive feelings, no doubt. There was a wonderful example about, as we were talking about an example of when you felt very welcome. And somebody shared an experience like being on the basketball team. We got together as a team. We were young, we were carefree. We didn't care about what the world had constructed our identities as, but we got together, we were playing a common game that we love, and we were competing. Somebody else shared this example about someone thought enough about them to help celebrate their birthday in this COVID environment, right? The chairs were socially distanced, hands were sanitized, and it meant everything to the person because they don't even celebrate their birthday, right? So in coming into spaces where you even somewhat familiar with where you're going to be, interacting with people, it can be a very terrifying thing. And to be seen and to be welcome and somebody to say, hello, how you doing? Can I get you something to drink? That's radical, right? That's the radical nature of it, right? And lastly, this notion that relationships is revolutionary, right? And I understood that as, I think life, if you boil life down to its essence, it is relationships. and how we relate to each other. Some of those relationships are romantic in nature. Some of those relationships are business oriented. They could be a student, teacher, and otherwise. But we're always relating with each other, right? And how do we continue to create space where those feelings of belonging, right? Being valued as a person among the spaces in which we find ourselves. And of course, I think the biggest project is how do we scale that up to meet those structures that we didn't get into, but we're much aware of. I hope I captured the essence of what we're talking about.
Great, thank you so much, Sedric. Fatiya, would you like to go next?
Yes, I can. I already sent this to my group. So I did a quick presentation and I had a couple quotes that I'd love to share in this chat again. But honestly, I don't think that we had enough time to have a full conversation. I was absolutely in love with everyone's thoughts and comments they brought into this, and it was kind of way too short. But again, my topic was regarding radical love and care. And in some ways, we kind of attempted to define that. So I don't think we had a specific conclusion, but radical just being like far-fetching or revolutionary, and then how like love can be political, also very like personal and communal, and then care and the importance of specifically self-care when discussing or for women of color. I wish that I could just pass it on to members of my group. It was such an interesting discussion in the sense of women of color are often the ones that our needs are ignored as well as their suffering and pain, but they're also the ones that are able to still showcase like complete utter love or like almost never ending love for their community and their loved ones. And we talked about that in the sense of both societies that we were all a part of. A lot of us weren't born here. A lot of us came from immigrant communities. And how important that conversation is, but then also in regards to like activism and progressing society. I think the first quote that I had brought that in, that if we don't include conversations of radical love and care and showcase that into activism or social justice, then we kind of end up copying and pasting what we've done before. And even the ways that we view a successful like social movement is just a stagnation or continuation of the things that we're running away from, like I mentioned previously. So those are a couple of the topics that we talked about. It was a very interesting range.
Great, that sounds like a really great conversation. Thank you. Jennings.
I think like any good roundtable session, we could have easily gone on for another 3 or 4 hours with what people were thinking about and had to say. We talked about the idea of like if the world is ending or has ended, who has it ended for and who does it continue for? Was a point. At what point is it just a person or a community's world, and at what point is it the whole world? And are we approaching a point where it will be both? We also talked about control and the idea of accepting loss of control and accepting that there are things beyond your control in the context of if you go through the world with the feeling like it has already ended, you don't have to save the world. It's enough to survive.
Thank you, Jennings. There's a lot in that. And Olga.
God, there's a lot here too. It was, I thought it was an interesting conversation and everybody contributed to it with interesting points and examples. So I guess, I mean, it began with a concern for, I brought up first this idea of mutual aid is not a new thing, and now it is called mutual aid, but it has been around forever. And is it Western? Is it indigenous? I mean, there is a Western version, I guess, of mutual aid, and then there are indigenous practices that continue to be practiced in very organic ways in different parts of the world with larger indigenous populations, and which, you know, in movements, right, get borrowed and reproduced in other spaces, right? Which are not necessarily the place of origin of people. But there is this concern, you know, I mean, on one end, right, do these communal practices, mutual aid practices, do they allow for the state to get away with it? I mean, by doing what the state doesn't do, then do we leave the state off the hook, right? Is one of the extremes, right? And the other one is that there has been forever these practices. So this is a way of life. For many people and groups, this is part of their identity, it's part of their culture, right? It is, so it's organic. So how do we deal with everything in between? Because in between, the question is, now we're responding to a crisis and now it becomes a big topic, but then the crisis disappears and we're back to what? Because if it is not organic, it might just disappear, right? And if we go back to trying to see how many experiences have disappeared, then what is it that makes it sustainable and organic or not? Is it the practice itself, you know, which is reciprocity of goods and services, right? But the problem is who is helping who and if everybody participates. And not everybody participates. So then that contributes to the non-organic practice of mutual aid, right? So I'm trying to synthesize in a way. And then there were other concepts, I mean, related to it that also signal, they're like, should make us alert. To what extent, you know, there are practices that are also co-opted by nonprofit organizations, and then it turns into an extractivist mode. Or through models of entrepreneurship, Ruth Ann brought the example of artists who might first engage in a very reciprocal, you know, solidarity type of relationship, but then it turns into, it evolves into, or how in the practice of mutual aid, you know, people who begin and who have a practice that is non-hierarchical and in the beginning turn out reproducing the hierarchies that they are against in the beginning. So there are challenges, and these are challenges that that we discuss and should be taken into account. Because at the end, I mean, one thing that we forget is that it's not new. So why are we treating it as new? And we should remind ourselves that we can't forget, because otherwise we're just going to repeat the same over and over and over, right? Without having even a learning curve. So, I mean, I'm trying to synthesize this. Yeah.
So, can we back up a little bit? So there's a question that's been asked. There have been some people who haven't engaged with other things yet. There's a prior question. Could you just say a little bit more about what mutual aid is?
Okay. So in the way that mutual aid, and this is the question. I mean, as I said, I engage. I mean, I was like, well, what is mutual aid, right? Why are people calling it mutual aid? And this is a concept, I mean, that goes back. I mean, I don't want to get into literature, right? But there is in the literature this writer, Kropotnik, who is the one who proposes this idea of mutual aid, right? And this is a Western idea of how to organize yourself communally, right, to help each other. So this is really a practice that in other cultures has many other different names. So it's a practice of reciprocity. It is a practice of communal organizations, right, trying to address how to survive and respond to the needs of their community. So it is community-based.
Great, thank you.
That it has the term mutual aid, it's mutual aid for some, and in the Andes where I worked, it's called AINI.
I wonder, Fatiya, if you might have something to say, because I was thinking what Olga's talking about is how we think about it as a new practice. So like when there's a crisis and then people come together and think that, oh, this is a new way of doing things. And it's always had to be a practice in other places. But you brought up a really interesting point that it's not simply an ongoing, well, there is an ongoing cultural way to think about it, but it's also like for immigrant communities and for women of color in different communities, it's both part of a way of doing things, but it's also out of necessity of being in a new place as well. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I'd love for Jennings to talk a bit about that and the survival mechanism as well after. But yeah, I feel like a lot of groups, both nationally and internationally, when they face like such violence, persecution, especially when it's continuous and it's not just the legacy, although the legacy matters too. Your only survival technique is to showcase this mutual aid, because systems that should be working for you, whether it's systems of justice, systems of government, or even systems of schooling, like blatantly don't care about you or treat you very differently, then you're forced to kind of create that community within your like where you're from or people who are very similar to you. But yeah, I don't think I could summarize it as amazingly as Olga. But I think it's really, really important to realize that from both an ally's perspective, but then also like from what I've been doing, like women of color perspective, like just look up and notice when you are doing that mutual aid, if you're doing it consistently and continuously, and then for whom are you doing it for? Even if the answer is you, that's still extremely impactful and really important. But yeah, it's kind of my perspectives.
And Jennings, I was wondering, so it seems to me like you want to focus on when the world has already been destroyed, then it's not about saving the world, but it's about survival. Do you see connections between that and what Fatiya and Olga are saying, that in order to survive, there has to be some sort of collective something? And so it's not to save the world, but it's part of surviving. How do you think that when you're thinking about a post-apocalyptic world?
I think definitely, because you can survive as an individual, but you can't live as an individual. You have to live within a community. So it has to be the labor of a community and the continuing labor of the community and the mutual labor of the community to continue to exist and care and receive and give care.
And that might be a place where Sedric might come in. Like, how do you see this notion of relationship and what others are saying here?
Yeah. You know, to try to scale what Jennings, for example, have been saying in terms of the idea of individualism is one of the greatest myths this country has ever produced, perhaps. Perhaps it's a Western idea. I couldn't tell you how embarrassed I would be if it was up to me, if I had to make my own clothes sitting up here right now. We're all dependent on other people. We all have different talents and so forth, right? And so that's what I mean by how we belong to each other, right? And we need something from each other because we all have different skill sets that we do, clothing, housing, so forth. So human beings have come together to survive. The question is, why do we stay together? And then we've got these hierarchies that's out there. And I think when we were talking in our group and what I hear the comments I will lastly say, that nobody invoked anything about professional status or how much money they had. It's all about our connectedness as people. And if we can find a way to retain enough of that, right? Whether the world is coming to an end, and the whole idea of mutual aid would be more, in my mind, like our mutual responsibility to one another, right? Because if you help me celebrate my birthday and it's planful and it's thoughtful, then I may turn around and do the same thing. Now, I know everybody's not going to follow that, and we can find, if you will, enough safeguards to restrain those who don't want to participate after they've been given so freely too.
So there's a question that somebody raised, and It's really interesting given the combination of what you're all saying. And this person says, there's been lots of different apocalypses. So I'm kind of paraphrasing to bring it into the question. Colonialism and the destruction of indigenous civilization, industrialism, the world wars, the world wars and the destruction of European life, modern colonialism, and the destruction of Palestine, Syria, and the rest of the Middle East. So what are some ways that we can think about, like, it's not just one concept of apocalypse, it's like there's specific apocalypses where different worlds have ended and that we are in relationship or complicit in different ones at different times. So how might we think about this notion of aid and care when the notion of apocalypse and the ending of worlds and our role in them is so complicated?
One of the things that came up in our group was about our discussion about control is that you can't control when your world ends. You can't. It's all factors beyond what you can control, and you can, you know, be unhappy about it. You can try to fight it, and in some cases you can even stave it off. But it is an inevitability. Like, the universe will grow too large and too cold to sustain life. This is a thing that we can't escape. I thought of this particularly in the context of people posting after the election, which was that the United States is not even 250 years old. Greater empires have fallen and will fall. And I think that gets back to Olga's idea about the state, and if we can only rely on mutual aid, does that make the state obsolete?
Would any of you like to?
Five people in my heads all tip their head.
Yeah, if anyone would like to respond to that.
No. Unfortunately, it doesn't make it obsolete. I mean, that's my perspective, I guess. Because, I mean, based on what the things that came out in my group was actually the opposite. It's like they get away with it. I mean, they have less work, less responsibilities. There is no moral quandrum. I mean, they don't worry. I mean, it is the people who are looking after themselves. And they can just continue doing business as usual. Or they can come up also worldwide, as it was also brought up, in understandings of mutual aid that are far from being mutual aid, right? Which is becoming or pretending to become the savior, right, of others. And one of the participants brought up, like in the case of the United Nations, we are so celebratory of the United Nations, right? And align ourselves as Macalester with the United Nations without being critical at all about the disaster, right? It has also committed in many places. So, and again, in creating, you know, a vision, an image of the United Nations or these international organizations that come to save and instill, also contribute to this understanding. Many people, it's like, oh, finally they have come to help me or to help us. So this, it survives the state and more than just the state, global power. And it also brought the question even home. I mean, if we talk about states and little states and mini states, I mean, if we take Macalester, right? The question was, well, how do we also need to ask ourselves, what is it that we are doing with the communities that we are supposed to be showing solidarity with, right? Is it really a model, right, of reciprocity? It's not, because if we are basically responding to crises and models that have to do with responding to the needs of other without thinking that there is an interdependent and reciprocal relationship, it will never be organic. Never. Right? So it's basically, if the focus is on the resources without the value, the principle that ties us all, then it will never be organic. So the state can't survive, unfortunately. As we know, we will like a different state.
I have two different questions. Yeah.
So our failed state, right?
Our failed state.
Our failed state. This is a mutual aid device, and our state failed to tell people it was a good thing to do. You know, it was astonishing to me, but it shouldn't have been, right? They couldn't see a way to extract profit out of it. Tell me why the state chose to downplay the importance of this really simple mutual aid device, you know?
I think Ruth Ann has started a good model here. Let's open it up for conversation. And so either you can ask a question or make comments, or I think we could do this. Why don't we just try, if you have something to say, go ahead and just start talking. And if it sounds like we're starting to talk over each other, we'll have to raise hands or something. But what are some of you thinking about this conversation and what you heard in your own group and what you've heard in the roundtable that followed?
I know I speak a lot, but Ruth Ann's point was like really, really impactful from my end. I'm really curious of asking everyone here, how do you embark in this conversation of creating mutual aid or creating a community, especially when the people that you're trying to aid don't want that aid or don't care to? Like, my topic was regarding like women of color, and a lot of the times like our mothers are the ones that like have internalized aspects of either racism or sexism and like have like reflected that onto us. And like, how do you have that conversation without obviously coming, as everyone at Macalester does obviously have a great amount of privilege, so without coming from like an elitist perspective? Just wanted to say, the reason Ruth Ann reminded me of that is in regards to mass. Like, that's something that should be so obvious. It's something that protects, even if you're selfish, protects you and everyone around you. So how do you embark in that conversation?
You know, that's where I think the state comes in. You know? I remember, if this analogy holds up, during the civil rights movement, people would tell Dr. King that laws cannot be passed to change the human heart. And he goes, okay, sure, but laws can be made to restrain the heartless, right? You take something like a mask that can protect, as we now know it, perhaps we didn't know it at one point, that can protect both the person who wears it and those around us. And we know it has been politicized in our kind of exercise in egregious tribalism in our political situation that we have now. And you're always going to have people who throw caution to the wind and who are going to do things just the opposite of what they should do. I hope I do that less nowadays. If I get in a car and speed or eat something that I shouldn't, that's going to cause harm, and it could cause somebody else harm. But yeah, I mean, something that the state failed to do, and you allow individuals to do it, and that's what happens. And then you get those who deny that they want to use the state in one way versus the other, don't realize how much the state played a role in the development of the geopolitical entity called the United States of America. And then you turn around to the world and you offer them mutual aid when you have extracted the wealth directly or indirectly, right? And then you're gonna turn around and give mutual aid. That might be reparations of some sorts because you have wreaked so much havoc in other places. And that mindset, as I understand it and talking to some people in the Native community, if you look at the mode of production of the last 500 years, we have rape and pillage this area in ways in which it had not been done for tens and thousands of years, right? And so that's what and going back to this whole idea of having a radical notion of belonging is to critically examine how we relate to each other, how we relate to the earth. And at some point, somebody's going to have to pull this thing together. I didn't say it was going to be easy. It's going to be a party, but the practice got to start somewhere, and it has. But again, the scaling of it is a part of the revolution too.
Heads in the same way. I think within that, I would push us to consider factionalism rather than tribalism, particularly in the context of COVID relief, because Indigenous nations handled that very well.
You see, thank you, Jennings. You rescued me from myself in that regard. The language we use that's been given to us, right, is full of stuff, and we always want to, again, examine that for what we're trying to communicate. And that was an unintentional way of saying something that missed the mark.
But I think not to detract from the point as a whole, which the work isn't going to be easy, and we have to keep doing it, and also do it faster than we've been doing, because we haven't been doing it fast enough.
So I was wondering what people think. So in the panel this morning, a couple of the panelists, so I wanted, since Macalester has been named, I thought I'd pick up on that. And a couple of the panelists this morning said, not just Macalester, but education is the place where we're socialized and taught to become, we're socialized into the colonial mindset. So as some of you have been talking about, not just in relationship to communities around us and the way we interact with them, but just like developing this competitive mindset that we're supposed to win, the better grades, the prizes and all of that. And all of that is about creating knowledge about other people. And so when we study other communities, or a lot of studying is like, this is for me, this is for my paper, this is for my academics. What might it look to move towards what you're all talking about, whether it's radical belonging or mutual aid or care or understanding our role in apocalypses and the destruction of other communities? What might it look like to move towards something different? Because again, this is about how can we move towards building new worlds and not just reproducing the same when we are part of institutions that are doing all the things that you're saying the state does, like education is part of the state. It's a state mechanism.
One of the things that came up in our group is the idea that we might just have to burn it all down. And that there's some things you fundamentally can't reform.
This is true. This is an opinion that I hold personally about most things. You can't really reform a country whose whole basis is racism and is the suffering of other people. You can't reform that. You can't reform higher ed. You really do just need to burn it all down. I know that sounds very I don't know, sarcastic or just joking, but that's seriously how I feel. And yeah, I resonate with that, Jennings.
And, on that point, I will have to disagree because, it is wrong. It is a lot to, a lot of stuff that need to be changed. And when you look at it from a lot of perspectives, you'll think that, hey, there's nothing we can do about it. We can burn it down. But I think that one way we could go about it, which is instead of burning it down, it's a matter of adapting it. Because, what we're talking about here, tribalism, the sense of not belonging, racism, all those issues with society as we know it today, as the global society, those are not and I don't think that there are things that are unique to our modern society. I think there are things that have been common throughout the history of human society itself. tribalism especially is, I would say, part of human history itself, which is why, we have different countries around the world to begin with, different cultures to begin with. And I think that with Sedric's point to sort of bringing a better sense of belonging, I just have a question because, so many different people are different and so many people do not see things the same way. So how do you bring in, and I think that this is part of the whole adaptation thing, which is instead of burning it down, how do we bring in people who are so fundamentally different together under the same umbrella? And I think that's kind of the most important question to me.
Ooh, that's well beyond my salary range or my capacity. Yeah, the scaling up of radical belonging is truly a revolution. I'll just quickly say, I've been relying on John Powell, who's at Berkeley, who has an Institute of Belonging. And he was recently talking about the whole idea of belonging is what you create together. You don't belong just because you're in the same space. We have identities, and some of us rally around those identities and we bridge with others, and other times we break, right? And we see the breaking in the political environment right now. And so when he was talking to one of the clergy, he was saying that, and John Paul's claim is that we all are in the circle of humanity. And we got to find a way to connect and relate to one another. And per your point, the pastor said to John Powell, well, do I have to, bridge and develop a relationship with the devil? And John Powell just said, well, don't start there, right? Just don't start there. You got to start where you can and get the practice going. And all you can do is hope that you bring that practice into being. Again, we have been taught in many ways to not like ourselves, to hate ourselves. The idea of white supremacy is one of the most dangerous ideas, I think, in the modern world. And like I said, yeah, it's tough, but it has to start in many ways in small practices. And why not at the 1600 block of Grand Avenue? And then we can take that into other spaces. And as Jennings and others have said, we don't know. We can't control everything. And this is my last point really, is what Cornel West says, is that he tries to tell the truth, condemn white supremacy, condemn male supremacy, homophobia, and the like. Love across the board and live with the consequences.
To continue with like somewhat of that thought, like what I brought up in the group when we were talking about radical love and self-care is how women of color traditionally not only love the people that they're supposed to love, they even love the people that bring pain to them and their tormentors, and even smile through the abuse. And so one of the things I talked about, to do radical self-care and to change that radical love towards myself, is to stop being quiet about the pain that I'm feeling, about the treatment that I'm receiving. Especially, and like you said, started here at 1,600 grand. So I do want to be a person that speaks up more and say, instead of just going along with it, or just, still getting along with those who cause me pain, it's just no, now you're going to see the pain you're caused. Now you're going to see the result of the actions that you've taken against me, instead of me making it easier for you and making you comfortable. Now it's time for me and other BIPOC people here to be comfortable, because we do belong here at Macalester as well. We earned our way here just like you did. And then a point, there was a question brought up in our chat that we didn't really get to address about what does it look like to see love from our community? And a big point of that is if people started attending some of these trainings and some of these conversations where they can hear about how we feel about what's going on or how we're being treated, or simply stop denying my experience here at Macalester. Don't tell me Macalester is great and it's perfect for everyone, when I know for a fact it's not perfect for everyone.
Thank you so much for that, Darisha. And this kind of makes me think, like this idea of burn it all down. It seems to me what you're talking about is like burn part of it down, but save the part that like we could do something with. So there's this concept that's going around, and it's kind of in a way symbolic, but this notion of steal from the university. And it doesn't mean like take the plates and forks and stuff. It's like, don't be a part of the university to think that we're here to save it. As Jennings is saying, we're not here to save the world. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't have access to the tools that are necessary for our own communities. And so rather than being in the university to perpetuate it and to continue its education and socialization, how do we take the knowledge and through radical relationship building or radical care or mutual aid, how do we build something else using what the university can offer us or the college can offer us that isn't just about trying to change it, but how do we take from it what we need to bring to other spaces? Is there anybody that would like to have a final comment? We are it's 5:59 right now. So just like Jennings said, all of the groups could have taken 3 to 4 hours. This could have taken a lot longer too, but we're gonna have to wrap up. So if anyone has any final comments, please say them now.
I would like to just say that I think that we all experience a lot of frustration. I've often throughout my life experienced tremendous frustration because we don't see the progress that we want to see in institutions, in our society, in our communities. But I think that we have to resist the temptation to throw in the towel and give up, and we have to continue to struggle. And I think that it's in the struggle itself that we build community with others, and that we build solidarity with others, and that we build a better life, even in the struggle, even as we're not seeing the progress we want to see. But I think the struggle is what's really important.
Great, thank you so much, Professor Griffin. Any panelists? Is there anything, last minute things that you'd like to say before we close?
I would add that, in my view at least, stealing from the university does also mean taking their plates and forks and stuff.
I'm not saying that, but far be it from you to stop you from saying it. Okay.
I wouldn't have put the Idea Lab stuff there.
Okay, and with that, that's a good note to leave. Thank you so much, everybody. It's great to see you here, and thanks especially to all the panelists and to everybody, Matt, Meg, Jean is still here, everyone, Ruth, everyone who's been working behind the scenes to make this all possible. Thanks again, and we'll see you soon. Bye.